Good morning, everyone.
Good
Hi, sir.
morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Morning. So good to see all of you. And of course, we will be doing a rapid revision of two important concepts in your SBR syllabus, one of which is leases and the other one is income taxes. So the accounting standard on leases has a fair amount of testing happening in your SBR paper. If you look at all the different types of questions that have been asked, you will see that sale and leaseback has been tested. Then accounting or disclosures from the point of view of the lessor have been considered. Then you might find questions, where separating the components of a lease and, all of these aspects could also be tested. So it's not as if leases operates, in isolation. It of course goes ahead with a lot of other discussions that are already there as a part of your syllabus. And there is an interaction of leases later with IAS 12 इनकम टैक्सेस सो वो एक पार्ट है एंड देन देर इज वन छोटा सा स्पेशल ट्रांजैक्शन कॉल्ड सब लीज तो वो सब लीज हम अलग से डिस्कस मतलब वील डिस्कस इट टुडे ओनली वील डिस्कस इट विद दिस बट दैट्स अ सेपरेट डिस्कशन ऑल टुगेदर. Now, off late now, leases wala question. If you look at Benito company, that is a question on leases, but that involves thoda sa ratio analysis also for that matter. So be a little aware in terms of, what kind of different possibilities are there within the framework of IFRS 16. Now, the accounting standard on leases basically is one of the best examples of substance over form. Why substance over form? Because in this standard, the situation is that you don't legally own the asset. Okay. Legally, the asset is not in your name, and yet what happens is you are accounting for that as your own asset, which, and the reason behind that is that although this is a leased asset for which you are paying annual lease rentals or monthly lease rentals, it behaves pretty much like any other non-current asset that you are holding. So the accounting standard on leases, as I told you, is one of the best examples of substance over form. Now have a look at this. Why lease accounting is, of course, because if you go with the rent to cash entry, then it doesn't really make any sense given the fact that we are trying to do a faithful representation of all the transactions that happen in the entity. Now, when I record a lease transaction or when I record a lease that as a tenant, as a lessee, I have taken the entry that I record at the inception of the lease is right of use asset account debit to lease liability. Now, this right of use asset is basically the asset that you have taken, but legally it is not in your name, and yet you have decided to record this particular asset in your books of accounts. Okay, now right of use asset is the leased item that you have taken, and lease liability is the amount that you have undertaken or promised to pay over the course of the next 5 years. Okay, so how exactly do we record a lease liability? Lease liability is initially measured at the present value of lease payments that have not yet been paid. So if I'm standing at the inception of the lease, at the beginning of the lease, I will have to find out what are the amounts that have not yet been paid. So there are, say, 5 lease rentals at T1, T2, T3, T4, T5. I'll write down the lease rentals one below the other. I will calculate the discounting factor, which is calculated on the basis of the interest rate implicit in the lease. I will apply the discounting factor, get the present value. Okay, that present value is the amount at which the lease liability will be recorded. When I say lease payments, it includes 5 items. One is the fixed payment. Second one is the variable rate payment, which depends on the index maybe that is given to you in the question. Then amounts expected to be payable under residual value guarantees and options to purchase the asset that are reasonably certain to be exercised. Options to purchase that are reasonably certain means there is a high probability or a high possibility that the option to repurchase the asset will be exercised by the entity. Now, a residual option to purchase the asset that are reasonably certain to be exercised, and termination penalties if the lease term reflects the expectation that these will be incurred. So if there is a high probability that you will end up terminating the lease agreement before its expected date. And in that situation, the contract mentions that a penalty will be levied on you. So in that particular situation, when a penalty could be levied on you and there is a probability that uh, this amount will be incurred, include those as well. We haven't seen questions which basically involve termination penalties yet. The discount rate that you should use will be the interest rate implicit in the lease. If that rate cannot be determined, then the entity should use its incremental rate of borrowing, and the rate will always be given to you in the paper. Take the present value of future lease rentals. So fixed payments, variable payments, which will depend upon an index or some other mode of calculation. Amounts expected to be paid under residual value guarantees, option to purchase where it is reasonably certain that the option will be exercised, and termination penalties. ये सबको जोड़ो, इसका write down the year on year cash flows, year 1 2 3 4 5, and then consider the discounting factor and you will get your answer. Okay, now there is a question later on the variable payments also. But say, for example, at the start of the year, the consumer price index was 100 and the lease rental was fixed at 250. Next year, the consumer price index goes to 116, and the lease agreement basically contains a clause which says that if the consumer price index increases, then the lease rental also increases in proportion to that amount. So year 2 ka lease rental will not be 250, it will be 2,90,000, and the lease liability will keep on getting reassessed in that case. You could also have an option to purchase, and if there is a high probability that the option to purchase will be exercised by the entity, then the amount under that purchase option should also be included. Please remember, all the amounts that we are including here are these committed or almost committed amounts which will have to be paid sooner or later, which is why all of these are included in the lease payment calculation. How do you calculate the value of a right of use asset? The right of use asset is primarily recognized at cost. IFRS 16 says that the initial cost of the right of use asset comprises of the amount of initial measurement of lease liability that we did in the lease liability calculation, lease payments made at or before the commencement of the lease. Okay, so if there was any payment made at T0, for example, we have a situation where the lease rental start at the beginning of the year, then in that case, lease liability will only be the cash outflows at the end of the next 3 or 4 years. But the amount paid at T0, which you are paying at the inception of the lease, that will not be included in lease liability. So how do you calculate the right of use asset? The right of use asset can be calculated as you take the total of your lease liability, and to that you add any amount paid at the inception or at the beginning or even before the inception of the lease, initial direct cost and estimated cost of removing or dismantling the underlying asset as per conditions of the lease. So right of use asset account debit to lease liability. This is the accounting entry. This right of use asset you are going to depreciate over the. How is the depreciation done? If ownership of the asset transfers to the lessee at the end of the lease term, then depreciation should be charged over the asset's remaining life. But if this is not the case, the ownership of the asset is not getting transferred to the lessee at the end of the lease term, then depreciation is charged over the shorter of useful life and lease term. Okay, and what exactly is the lease term? Lease term comprises of non-cancelable periods covered by an option to extend if it is reasonably certain that the option will be exercised, periods covered by an option to terminate the lease if reasonably certain not to be exercised. You will have to add all of the three together. That will give you your lease term. If the ownership of the asset is not transferring to the lessee at the end of the lease term, okay, in that case, the depreciation will be charged over shorter of the useful life and lease term. Okay. अब for if the lessee measures investment properties at fair value, then IFRS 16 requires that right of use assets that meet the definition of investment property should also be measured using the fair value model. Otherwise, most right of use assets are measured at cost, and we know what is cost. It is the total of these four items. Okay, now we understood how to account for a lease, but the right of use asset जो है, that right of use asset will keep on getting depreciated over the lease term, and we know how the depreciation is going to happen. What happens in case of lease liability is that at the end of every year you have to record an entry which basically takes into account the finance charges. तो आप कैसे करेंगे इसका? The particular entry will be, say for example, the interest rate implicit in the lease is 10%. The amount of lease liability that you recorded at the commencement of the lease is 37 lakh 90,000. Usko into 10% karo. 37 lakh 90,000 into 10%, that gives you 3 lakh 79,000. Record an entry, finance charges account debit to lease liability. This entry is also known as the unwinding of discount. And when you pay the amount of rental, the accounting entry should be lease liability to bank. So this entry, ये एंट्री सेम रहेगा because lease rentals are the same every year, but of course the finance charges वाला entry will be recorded. ठीक है, finance charges account debit to lease liability. This is the accounting entry for unwinding of discount, and then later of course you make the lease payment. Now, when lease rentals are paid at the start of the year, okay, how is the accounting entry recorded? When lease rentals are paid at the start of the year, IFRS 16 expects you to record this entry. Right of use asset account debit to lease liability to bank. Bank is credited with the amount of the first installment. Lease liability is credited with present value of unpaid installments, and right of use asset is debited with present value of unpaid installments plus any amount paid on day zero. ठीक है, this is how you would account for those leases which begin at the start of the year. Now, how do we, what is a lease? A lease is a contract which conveys the right to use an underlying asset for a consideration for a period of time. Lessor is the landlord who receives the consideration. Lessee is the tenant who transfers the consideration. ठीक है. Now, how do you identify a lease? A contract contains a lease if it conveys the right to control the use of the asset of an identified asset for a period of time in exchange for consideration. When you say right to control the use of the item, what does that mean? When I say right to control, I get the ability to decide how to use the asset. And it also specifically mentions an identified asset. So if you go to an airport and if you are, wanting to set up a coffee shop there, the airport authorities tell you that you will get a specific designated space in this particular part of the airport occupying this much area in front of pillar number XYZ. That is a situation of an identified asset, specifically bataya hai which asset is going to be or which area is going to be given to you. But if the contract says, you will get 200 square foot of place in the airport anywhere. If they say anywhere, that means it is not an identified asset. And if it is not an identified asset, then the contract does not convey the right to, then it is not a lease because there is no identified asset. There has to be a consideration for a certain specific period of time. Okay. And एक बार ये example देखो तो read the example first. That will help you to remember concepts. Just read it quickly.
Okay, sir.
Okay. Now, IFRS 16 specifically states that the customer does not have a right to use an identified asset if the supplier has the practical ability to substitute the asset for an alternative and it would be economically beneficial for them to do so. There are all these online apps and stores like Furlenco and Rentomojo, which basically give assets on rent to people who don't want to buy furniture. So when I shift houses, and I have to shift those once every 2 years at least. So what happens in that case is ki I don't buy furniture. Rento Mojo comes and it gives me furniture, or Furlenco comes and it gives me furniture against a specified rent every month. But if the contract says that, they have given me a microwave, but if the contract says that they can come and they can replace the microwave at any point of time and give a replacement microwave in return. See, they are not taking away the microwave. They are coming and they are replacing the old with a new one, or this one with another one. So in that case, if there is a right to substitute that the entity has, that if the landlord in this case, or if the owner in this case, which is for Lenko, if it has the right to come and substitute the asset, then that kind of a contract is not considered a lease. See, that doesn't happen in case of a premises, because if you have given me this premises, it means this premises only, no other premises. But if you have given me a microwave on rent and you have the right to come and replace the microwave at any point in time, then then I have not signed up for exclusively using a specific asset. It is for a microwave, it is not for a specific microwave. So where the owner of the asset has the ability in the contract to come and replace the asset with an alternative one, and it is economically beneficial for them to do so, then in that case, the contract does not contain a lease. Okay, now there are possibilities that a contract might contain a lease and a non-lease component. So you have two options. Either you account for the entire thing as a lease contract and do the proper lease accounting, but ideally what you should do is you have to split the lease and the non-lease component, and the split has to happen in the ratio of the standalone selling prices of those services. So if I have taken a premises on rent and I also have to pay, say for example, society maintenance charges, the total amount is say 60,000. But that 60,000 contains rental also, and it contains maintenance charges also. So ideally, what you should do in this case is you should split the rental, and you should split the total amount into rental and the maintenance part using the standalone rental value and the standalone value of the uh, maintenance agreement. Okay, and then you can do separate accounting. There is a question that we have done in class, so I will be sharing these notes with you. You can directly refer to the. So for separating components, this question applies. For some calculation relating to right of use asset, it is the immediately next following question. So for those people who did not study with me, just to give them a basic background, in every sheet that I give you, every concept is followed by a question related to that concept. So you don't have to search around anywhere, and it will give you that basic idea here how to calculate the amounts and how to include certain values in your answers. Up right at this point in time, if you don't have the ability to do the exam kit questions because of shortage of time, and there are many things that you want to do, तो मेरा आपको recommendation होगा, go through my Excel sheet. एटलीस्ट ना आपके कॉन्सेप्चुअल बेसिक्स क्लियर हो जाएंगे. द बेसिक्स विल बी क्लियर. देन उसके बाद ऑफ कोर्स इफ देयर इज एनीथिंग एल्स, थोड़ा सा we'll then have to rely on our good luck and stars aligning in our favor. बट बेसिकली अगर आप एक्सेल शीट देखोगे तो आपके कॉन्सेप्ट सारे कवर हो जाएंगे. कॉन्सेप्ट क्योंकि एक भी नहीं छोटा है इसमें, all the concepts have been covered. So if you are attempting the exam and you don't have too much time, you can go for this approach. ठीक है. So after this, after understanding how to separate the lease components, let's see what else is there in our discussion. We have short term and low value assets. Okay, what are these short term and low value assets? If the lease is short term, that is 12 months or less at the date of inception, or of a low value, then a simplified treatment is allowed. Basically, for tablets, small PCs, telephones, small items of furniture, if these items are basically, you don't do the full drama of lease accounting. All you do is you simply record an entry, rent account debit to cash, and your job is done. This is applicable for short-term leases or for low-value assets. Okay. Now, reassessing the lease liability. What is reassessing the lease liability? If changes to a lease liability occur, then the lease liability must be recalculated and its carrying amount should be adjusted. Now, what kind of changes am I talking about? So maybe there has been a modification in the overall duration of the lease. Okay. So earlier the lease term was 6 years. Now the lease term has become 9 years. So lease term undergoes a change. So the lease gets modified in this case. Or the entity's assessment of an option to purchase the underlying asset changes, or the lease rentals undergo a change. So what they do is they change the amount of lease rental. ठीक है. So ideally there are so basic जो आपका lease accounting हुआ था, it was done using certain basic assumptions. Now either the lease term has undergone a change, or a lease rental has changed, or there initially there was an assessment that you will not purchase the asset at the end of the lease term, but now your mind has undergone a change. Now you feel कि नहीं यार, let's take that asset later because we will need it. So naturally the cash outflow at the end of the lease term will change, which means your calculations will change. आपका ओरिजिनल कैलकुलेशन था एट द इंसेप्शन ऑफ द लीज दैट 2000 स्क्वायर फुट ऑफ ऑफिस स्पेस इज टेकन फॉर अ पीरियड ऑफ 5 years. एनुअल रेंटल वाज 1 लाख. ठीक है. रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट 10%. लीज रेंटल्स आर पेड एट द एंड ऑफ द ईयर. At the end of 3 years, the lease term was extended to 9 years. So original contract lease liability में क्या किया? You had taken 1 lakh, उसका present value 3,79,000. Then entry at the inception of the lease will be right of use asset account debit to lease liability. ठीक है. And then of course we'll have year one, two, all these years, we'll keep on calculating right of use asset to lease liability हो गया, then depreciation to right of use asset, and finance charges to lease liability. वो तो चलता रहेगा till the end of year three. What happened at the end of year three? At the end of year three, you were told that now the lease term is getting extended. अभी what does the lease table look like at the end of year three? End of year three मतलब year one and year two चला गया. You are standing at the end of year three. ठीक है. अब there is a the lease liability balance at the end of year three in books of accounts is how much? It is 173,450. Why do I say it is 173,450? See, where did I start? I started my lease liability at 3,79,000. Okay. To this 3,79,000, I added, sorry, this into 10%, I added this much interest, then I subtracted 1 lakh. ठीक है. How much was the balance at the start of the second year? 316,900. ठीक है. So year one के end पे closing balance कितना था? 316,900. 10% interest, 1 lakh का lease payment. 10% interest, 1 lakh का lease payment. 10% interest, 1 lakh का lease payment. How much is the closing outstanding? The closing outstanding is 173,450. अब लीज लाइबिलिटी एट द एंड ऑफ द ईयर थ्री इन बुक्स ऑफ अकाउंट्स इज 173,450. एंड नाउ यू हैव बीन टोल्ड कि लिसन, अब दिस लीज इज नॉट फॉर 3 years, दिस लीज इज फॉर अ टोटल पीरियड ऑफ 9 years. टोटल पीरियड ऑफ 9 years मतलब 9, जिसमें से 3 years हैव ऑलरेडी गॉन बाय, दैट मीन्स 6 years. अब नेक्स्ट पेमेंट कब होगा? आई एम स्टैंडिंग एट द एंड ऑफ ईयर थ्री. नेक्स्ट पेमेंट विल हैपन 1 year from now, then 2 years from today, then 3 years from today. So write down all the cash flows. The rate of interest has not changed, that has remained the same. Write down the discounting factor and you will get the present value, which is 435,400. Now you had assessed your lease liability. आपका जो calculation था, it was 173,450, but now the present value has changed. Now it is 435,400. At the end of year three, the reassessed lease liability is 435,400, and the book value of lease liability as at the end of the year three is 173,450. So book value है 173,450. Reassessed amount after the modification of lease term is 435,400. Whatever is the increase in lease liability, you calculate that. What is the accounting entry you record? You will credit lease liability and you will debit the right of use asset. ठीक है. So the entry for reassessing the lease liability on account of modification of the term is right of use asset to lease liability recorded with this particular number, and then of course you keep on depreciating. वो सब फिर normally चलता रहेगा. So this is a situation where one of the terms of the lease got modified, and which is why you had to reassess the lease liability. उसका corresponding effect कहाँ जाएगा? The corresponding effect will go to right of use asset. Okay. Now there is a situation of sale and lease back, which is a smart way that business entities often employ in order to generate immediate cash for working capital while still continuing to hold the asset and use it for their business purposes. ठीक है, एक बार quickly read this, just read from here to here. I'll show you the diagram and then we'll see the accounting. ठीक है, now, so what happens is the original owner of the asset, that is this seller, he sells the asset to the buyer and then he leases back the asset from the buyer. So he transfers the asset to the buyer pays him cash, uska working capital problem or cash flow problem gets solved, he gets 10 crore rupees. Then the asset is leased back to him, and then the original seller, who is now the lessee, makes periodic cash payments. ठीक है, in this sale and lease back arrangement where the transfer is a sale, ठीक है, and the question will always say whether the transfer is a sale or not a sale. If it fulfills all the conditions of calling it a sale as per IFRS 15, then consider it to be a sale. Otherwise उसका accounting थोड़ा अलग होगा, where the transaction is sale and lease back and it qualifies as a sale, the transfer qualifies as a sale. The accounting entry is bank account debit, right of use asset account debit, lease liability credit, machine credit, P&L credit. Now at this point in time when you are less than a week away from your exams, आप learn करो what account gets debited with what amount. What does the bank account get debited with? The bank account gets debited with the amount received. ठीक है, lease liability gets credited with the present value of lease rentals. Okay, then machine account gets credited with carrying amount of the asset transferred, and P&L account gets, सो अच्छा ये हो गया अमाउंट रिसीव, लीज लाइबिलिटीज पीवी ऑफ लीज रेंटल्स, मशीन इज कैरिंग अमाउंट ऑफ असेट ट्रांसफर्ड, राइट ऑफ यूज असेट इज डेबिटेड विद carrying amount of the asset transferred into PV of lease rental upon fair value of asset transferred. See, when we were in the class, we discussed the whole story कि यार ये formula ऐसा क्यों है. Now is not the time to get into the formula. Formula learn करो और paper में जाओ. Balancing figure is your profit or loss. ठीक है, when the transfer is not a sale, it is then as per IFRS 16, the seller lessee continues to recognize the transferred asset and will record a finance liability equal to transfer proceeds. We have seen this in financial instruments. Now, while that was accounting for the lessee, that is the tenant, we also need to understand how does the landlord or the lessor account for a transaction of lease. A landlord basically has to classify, or a lessor basically has to classify a lease into an operating lease and a finance lease. See, while there are different conditions that have been given about deciding whether a particular lease is an operating lease or a finance lease, remember one thing, it's not something, although there are conditions given, you have to use one common sense logic. What is that common sense logic? Ki see, if the lease arrangement is basically acting as, if the lessor is also acting like a bank in the sense ki he is giving you the asset and you are utilizing the asset for a major part of its useful life, or the total present value of lease rentals paid is equal to a major chunk of the value of the fair value of the asset on that date. If all of these conditions are there, if all of these points are mentioned, then there is a very high possibility कि यार the person, by the time the lease period comes to an end, the lessee would have utilized almost all of the asset, तो कुछ बचा नहीं होगा. So it is as good as he owned and he ran the asset for the entire term. Or by the end of the lease term, there is an arrangement that the lessee will purchase the asset, and it is reasonably certain that he will exercise the option to purchase the asset. Again, in that case, you can say that it is a finance lease. अब अनफॉर्चुनेटली ना IFRS 16 ने ऐसा बहुत स्पेसिफिकली नहीं बोला है कि देर आर 7 conditions and out of those 7 you have to fill 5 or you have to fulfill 7. ऐसा कुछ भी नहीं बोला है. So basically you will have to decide on the basis of facts of the case whether the lease is a finance lease or an operating lease. Now, not too many questions surrounding a finance lease and operating lease have been asked in the paper, but uh, how do you know whether the lease is an operating lease or a finance lease? There are several conditions that need to be fulfilled. एक बार quickly go through these and the explanations for each one of them. Tell me once you are done, I will scroll. देख लिया?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Chalo, look at the remaining 3 conditions. Okay. Now, the sad part, like in a lot of other standards, is that IFRS 16 does not specify how many conditions need to be fulfilled to call it a finance lease. Basically, what we are trying to see is the lessee getting the asset at the end of the lease term? Or is the total value of payments close enough to the fair value? Or does the lease term cover almost all of the asset's economic life? So if somewhere this is getting fulfilled, then you can safely assume that you're primarily checking whether the lessee is kind of, utilizing all the benefits from the lease over its useful over the lease term useful life. Then you can say that it is a finance lease. If it is a finance lease, what happens is for the lessor, one moment, guys, one moment. So, how does a lessor account for a finance lease? And at the inception of the lease, the lessor presents assets held under a finance lease as a receivable. The value of the receivable is the present value of fixed payments Variable payments that depend on an index rate. So basically, whatever was lease liability mein calculation for the lessee, the same amount card present value will be considered for the lessor. You take the present value of these payments. There is one more addition here, which is unguaranteed residual value. Iska total, I mean, take the write down the individual items, calculate the present value. That amount should be shown as net investment in the lease. Record a receivable by the name of net investment in the lease at present value of lease payments to be received. Then de-recognize the carrying amount of the non-current asset because it is exiting the business and the difference is gain or loss. And then of course the way aapka, you record an entry for finance charges account debit to lease liability. Here you record an entry, net investment in lease account debit to interest income, and then bank account debit to net investment in the finance lease. ठीक है. अब everything else is the same in terms of kiska present value nikalna hai. The only difference is the unguaranteed residual value, which is not included there. Operating lease, from a lessor standpoint, what he should do is he should recognize income from the operating lease on a straight line basis, and any direct cost of negotiating the lease should be added to the cost of the underlying asset. Now, if the transactions are not at fair value, okay, sale and leaseback transactions are not at fair value, or other transactions are not at fair value, if it is below market terms, it is treated as prepayment of lease. If it is above market terms, it is treated as an additional financing arrangement. इस पे ना one of the exam questions is also based on this, by the way. तो एक बार past exam question को देख लेना. Apart from that, there is one question I will let you read on your screen right now. It kind of closely ties up with the situation where the amount received is more than the fair value. ठीक है, एक बार just go through this. I will increase the size for you to read. ठीक है, look at the original entry, and then of course I'll make you read the rest of the part. ठीक है, पहले नीचे वाला part देख लो, and then look at the entry. Yes, Viral, tell me.
Whenever there is in the fair value is less than what we have received, we will always going to adjust within the present value of this
Correct.
lease liability. That's basically the assumption within the question, and we
Yeah,
are not going to separately record this 2 million. The 19 plus 2, we are not going to do this. We are always going to deduct it from the whatever we lease liability get.
that is correct. Okay. Now, talking about lessee disclosures, the lessee should primarily disclose the depreciation charged on ROU assets, interest expense on lease liability, expense relating to short-term leases and leases of low-value assets, cash outflows for leased assets, right-of-use asset addition, and maturity analysis. What is maturity analysis? Maturity analysis is basically splitting it into uh, करंट एंड नॉन करंट उतना ही पार्ट आपको दिखाना है नाउ you saw we discussed the reassessment of lease liability some time ago. उसी का छोटा सा extension is modification of lease. ठीक है. A modification of lease is a situation, see, in that case the lease term was modified. In some cases the lease rental could be changed. There is a small point that you need to understand when it comes to leases, which is a change in the scope of a lease or the consideration for a lease that was not a part of the original terms and conditions. So अगर आपका lease rental changes from 1 lakh to 1,50,000 और duration change हो जाता है lease का, so that is what lease modification is. An example of lease modification is adding or terminating the right to use one or more of the underlying assets or changing the lease term. A little around 15 minutes ago, we saw what happens when you change the lease term. कैसे वो value reassess होता है. The lessee must account for any lease modification as a separate lease if the modification increases the scope of the lease by adding the right to use one or more underlying assets, and the consideration increases by an amount that corresponds to the standalone price of the increase in the scope of the lease after adjusting for any specifics of the new contract. For any modification that is not accounted for as a separate lease, the lessee should recalculate the lease liability and right of use asset to reflect any reduction in scope and recognize a change in P&L. Basically, see, in the earlier case, it was not accounted for as a separate lease liability. वहां पे क्या किया? Just the amount underwent a change because आपका lease term increase हो गया था. So you recorded an entry. You debited the right of use asset with the differential amount and you credited the lease liability. But if the situation is कि यार पहले I had taken one classroom on rent, now I have taken three classrooms on rent, so I have increased the total number of assets covered under the lease. पहले एक classroom था, अभी कितना ज्यादा classroom हो गया मेरे पास. ठीक है. In that particular situation, this is an addition of scope and the rental under the lease also increases. So in that situation, we will have to account for that one as a separate lease. ठीक है, as a separate arrangement altogether. एक छोटा सा transaction है called sublease. अब sublease is not like a new concept. Okay, what happens is I have taken a premises on rent. I have taken one entire first floor on rent, and in some case, so I am paying my lease rental. ठीक है, मैं अपना lease rental दे रहा हूँ to my landlord. But my brother wants to start his business there, and I'm like, instead of you finding a new place for yourself and then paying a hefty brokerage charge and all of that, one room out of on my entire floor is kind of, not getting used by anyone. So you move in that part, so you pay me rental for that one room. So तू मुझे 15,000 दे, I will pay 1 lakh to my landlord. So this situation where the asset that was owned by me is subleased to someone else, that is the basic idea behind a sublease. तो ऐसे कुछ अलग नहीं हो रहा है उसमें. Sublease is the same thing. I took this premises on lease from Trisha, and two rooms out of these 60 rooms I leased out to Garvit. So that is a sublease. Okay, it's not like a different parallel concept altogether. इसी के साथ साथ चलता है. A transaction for which an underlying asset is released by a lessee to a third party and the lease between the head lessor and the lessee remains in effect. So the lease agreement between Trisha and me is intact, and that does not hamper the sublease agreement that I have made with Garvit. Now, in some agreements in real life, ना बहुत सारे agreements में ऐसे लिखा होता है कि you are not allowed to sublet once again. आपको sublet करना allowed नहीं है. That is specifically mentioned in the lease agreement. As separate contracts, the head lease and sublease are accounted for separately. A sublease should be classified by an intermediate lessor as follows. If the head lease is a short-term lease and the entity has elected to apply the recognition exemption as an operating lease, otherwise by reference to the right of use asset arising from the head lease as an operating lease or a finance lease. Basically, Trisha is the main lessor. She has leased out the asset to me. Trisha के लिए I am the lessee. I have leased out the asset to Garvit. ठीक है. So Garvit is my lessee. Garvit के लिए I am the lessor. So I am called the intermediate lessor. If this is an operating lease, Trisha has classified that as an operating lease and recorded the entry rent to cash. I will also record the same entry. If she has not done that, then I will have to do the full accounting. कुछ था इसमें, गर्वित? समझो, मैं आपको नहीं भी बताता तो भी एग्जाम में आप लिख पाते, राइट? बेसिक मतलब, बट स्टिल दिस वाज वन स्मॉल पॉइंट मेंशन्ड इन द स्टडी हब, तो आई थॉट एक बार डिस्कस कर लेते हैं. इज एवरीवन विथ मी सो फार?
Yes, sir.
अब
Yes, sir.
लीजेस पे ना
Yes,
काइंड ऑफ क्वेश्चंस दैट आर टेस्टेड. कभी कभी सेल एंड लीज बैक आता है, कभी कभी इन द एथिक्स वाला क्वेश्चन दे टेल यू दैट दिस इज द अकाउंटिंग दैट हैज हैपेंड एंड देन दे आस्क यू टू say whether this is done correctly or not, and in all cases it will be incorrect. फिर आप जाके बोलोगे ये अकाउंटेंट बेकार है, he does not have professional competence, and then of course things devolve further. Up the standard itself is not a very big standard. While we might have taken 6 hours to finish it, abhi we have been able to wind it up successfully in 45 minutes. ठीक है. सो लीजेस के क्वेश्चंस डिफिकल्ट नहीं है. दे आर नॉट एट ऑल डिफिकल्ट. दे आर प्रिटी स्ट्रेट फॉरवर्ड. सो don't harp too much on, simple ही limited number of transactions है, उतने देख लो, you should be good to go. ठीक है. Okay, we'll follow this up with IAS 12, which is on income taxes. ठीक है. I'll move on to the next accounting standard.